The need for a new constitution. Under the national project, the creation of a new written constitution is considered necessary for the long-term protection of civil liberties, democratic accountability, national sovereignty, institutional stability, and the lawful rights and freedoms of British citizens. The existing political structure is viewed as overly dependent upon parliamentary convention, temporary political majorities, evolving legal interpretation, and institutional trust rather than permanent constitutional protections. The national project argues that modern states become vulnerable when governments are able to steadily centralize power. Institutions operate without meaningful oversight. Strategic infrastructure falls under foreign influence. Emergency powers become permanent. Or political systems become increasingly disconnected from public accountability. The purpose of a new constitution is therefore not to strengthen state authority, but to permanently limit and regulate it through constitutional law, institutional balance, distributed oversight, transparency, and protected civil rights. The central constitutional principle of the framework is: no institution entrusted with power may exist without permanent accountability to constitutional law, public transparency, and independent oversight. Constitutional protection of rights and freedoms. The Constitution would formally define and permanently protect freedom of speech, lawful political expression, freedom of assembly, due process, privacy protections, democratic participation, protection from unlawful detention, and protection from unconstitutional state overreach. These rights would exist as constitutional guarantees rather than temporary political conventions. Certain constitutional rights would require exceptionally high legal thresholds to alter, suspend, or remove. The purpose of this structure is to ensure that no government, political movement, institution, or temporary parliamentary majority may easily dismantle the lawful freedoms of British citizens. Constitutional limits on government power. The national project views concentrated unchecked power as one of the greatest long-term threats to national stability regardless of political ideology. The Constitution would therefore establish permanent legal limits on executive authority, constitutional restrictions on emergency powers, separation of institutional powers, and multiple independent oversight systems. Emergency powers would automatically expire after fixed constitutional periods unless formally renewed through constitutional procedures and public oversight review. The purpose of these limitations is to prevent permanent crisis governance, political centralization, institutional abuse, and gradual authoritarian expansion. Separation of oversight institutions. The Constitution would prohibit any single institution from holding complete oversight authority over the state. Instead, constitutional oversight responsibilities would be divided across multiple independent bodies including constitutional courts, parliamentary ethics authorities, public audit organizations, transparency commissions, and constitutional defense structures. Each institution would possess limited but overlapping responsibilities in order to prevent concentration of oversight power, institutional capture, and the creation of an unaccountable internal authority structure. The framework argues that no organization tasked with protecting the nation should itself become immune from scrutiny. Constitutional transparency requirements. The Constitution would require all major state oversight and strategic institutions to operate under permanent transparency obligations. These obligations may include public quarterly reporting, financial auditing, operational review summaries, corruption investigation statistics, and independent constitutional inspections. The purpose of mandatory transparency is to reduce hidden institutional corruption, misuse of public authority, secret political influence, and long-term public distrust. The framework holds that institutions operating entirely without public visibility eventually become vulnerable to internal corruption and abuse. Constitutional leadership restrictions. To prevent institutional power consolidation, constitutional oversight leadership positions would operate under fixed-term limits, mandatory rotation, restrictions on consecutive leadership tenure, and post-service restrictions on direct entry into party political leadership. The objective is to prevent permanent political networks, institutional dynasties, and the long-term concentration of unelected authority. Restrictions on political alignment. Institutions responsible for constitutional oversight would be prohibited from direct party political participation. Oversight bodies and constitutional defense institutions would be restricted from political campaigning, party endorsements, partisan fundraising, and direct involvement in electoral competition. The purpose of this restriction is to preserve institutional neutrality and prevent constitutional structures from becoming political enforcement mechanisms. Constitutional role of the British Defence Force. Within the proposed framework, the British Defence Force would hold a constitutional responsibility not only to defend the territory of the United Kingdom, but also to defend the constitutional order itself. The BDF would remain legally restricted to homeland defence and internal national protection. Its constitutional role would include protection of democratic continuity, defense of lawful constitutional process, and refusal of unlawful authoritarian actions against British citizens. However, the BDF would not possess independent political authority over elections, legislation, party politics, or civilian governance. The force would operate strictly within predefined constitutional limitations and legal oversight structures. The purpose of this restriction is to prevent the armed forces from becoming a political ruling institution, an unelected governing authority, or an instrument for suppressing lawful public freedoms. Constitutional anti-corruption oversight. The National Project argues that democratic systems weaken when governments are capable of monitoring the public while remaining insulated from meaningful scrutiny themselves. Possible constitutional safeguards therefore include specialized constitutional integrity and anti-corruption bodies focused specifically upon elected officials, senior civil servants, strategic state institutions, and misuse of public office. These organizations would operate under judicial oversight, constitutional limitations, transparency requirements, and independent review systems. Their role would be monitoring corruption, identifying abuse of office, protecting constitutional integrity, and ensuring accountability inside government itself. The framework argues that public trust increases when political leaders remain visibly accountable. Constitutional oversight applies equally across institutions, and no political class becomes permanently insulated from scrutiny. Citizen constitutional participation. The framework also proposes limited citizen constitutional review mechanisms within major constitutional or emergency matters. Possible systems may include randomly selected citizen review panels, constitutional public oversight juries, and public constitutional review assemblies for exceptional state actions. The purpose of these systems is to prevent constitutional oversight from becoming entirely isolated within political elites, security institutions, or permanent bureaucratic structures. Constitutional civic education. The National Project argues that constitutions survive only when citizens understand their rights, institutional limitations, democratic process, and the dangers of corruption and political manipulation. The wider education system therefore includes civic education, constitutional awareness, media literacy, political accountability studies, and critical analysis training. The purpose of this educational structure is to create citizens capable of recognizing institutional abuse, defending constitutional freedoms, and participating responsibly within democratic society. Purpose of constitutional reform. The proposed constitutional framework is intended to protect the freedoms of British citizens, preserve democratic continuity, prevent authoritarian abuse, strengthen institutional accountability, reduce corruption, and maintain national sovereignty across future generations. The central principle of the framework is that the state exists to serve and protect the nation and its citizens, not to place itself above them. 2.1 Cost: the need for a new constitution. Low-cost scenario. Assumptions. Existing legal institutions mostly retained. No major court expansion. Small constitutional convention. Single referendum. Limited legal challenges. Existing civil servants handle much of implementation. One-off costs. Item cost. Constitutional Convention £25 million. Legal drafting teams £15 million. Public consultation £10 million. Referendum £150 million. Government implementation team £25 million. Legal updates and documentation £25 million. Total one-off cost £250 million. Annual running cost. Item cost. Constitutional Monitoring Office £20 million. Civic education materials £30 million. Reporting and audits £10 million. Annual cost £60 million. Medium cost scenario. Assumptions. Significant legal review required. Expanded constitutional court functions. New transparency systems. Larger public consultation process. Several years of implementation work. One-off costs. Item cost. Constitutional Convention £50 million. Legal drafting and review £40 million. Public consultation £25 million. Referendum £180 million. Department transition teams £100 million. Legislative rewrite program £100 million. Total one-off cost £495 million. Round to £500 million. Annual running cost. Item cost. Constitutional oversight bodies £75 million. Constitutional court expansion £75 million. Civic education £50 million. Annual cost £200 million. High cost scenario. Assumptions. Heavy legal resistance. Multiple Supreme Court challenges. Large-scale judicial restructuring. New constitutional court created. Extensive review of legislation. Several years of implementation disputes. One-off costs. Item cost. Constitutional Convention £75 million. Legal drafting and review £100 million. Public consultation £50 million. Referendum £200 million. Court restructuring £250 million. Legislative rewrite program £250 million. Legal challenge defense fund £250 million. Total one-off cost £1.175 billion. Round to £1.2 billion. Annual running cost. Item cost. Constitutional Court £150 million. Oversight institutions £150 million. Transparency systems £50 million. Civic education £50 million. Annual cost £400 million. Recommended planning figure. For CCND budgeting I would use Scenario 1 off cost annual cost. Low £250 million £60 million. Medium £500 million £200 million. High £1.2 billion £400 million. For the Treasury model I would use the medium figure, £500 million setup, £200 million annual, because it is large enough to be realistic but still tiny compared to overall UK government spending of over £1 trillion per year.